It's fundamentally a nuclear plant. The way to think about it is that it's a very complicated way to boil water. But if a peaceful nuclear explosion sounds like an oxymoron, that's because it is an oxymoron, right? A nuclear explosion is a way to make a nuclear weapon. There is nothing peaceful about it, right? This question is a little bit like being asked whether I want to die of cancer or of heart attack. The answer is I don't want either of them, right? Today, the cheapest sources of power happen to be renewables, solar and wind, solar especially, right? If they were really serious, they would just say, okay, here is $50 billion, go build me a few nuclear plants. They're not doing that. The AI bubble is going to burst sooner or later, right? It's a big bubble. And the moment it collapses, not only will the data center market go, it'll also take away all these SMR models, markets with it.
So I wanted to start off with, so I think Homi Bhabha, the founder of India's nuclear program, I think he had set a target in 1954 that India should have about 8,000 megawatts of of capacity by 1980. Um, it's 2026 now, and I'm not totally sure about what the figures are, but I'm guessing it is. I'm not too sure if we've hit 8,000 megawatts.
We have not.
Um, we have not. Any reason why? Because it seems like 40 years after the deadline was set, I would assume that we would be able to hit it. Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Yeah. So, sort of to back up, the promise of nuclear power has always been that it is going to grow in the future and produce huge amounts of power in around the world. This has been the case, and especially in the 1940s and 1950s, before we knew what was entailed in producing nuclear power, many people had assumed that it is going to be cheap, it's going to be easy, and it's going to be quick. And Bhabha was one of those people. Okay, and the you some people, some of your listeners may have heard the phrase "too cheap to meter." And this was the phrase that was used by Louis Strauss, who was the chairperson of the US Atomic Energy Commission, while speaking to a group of science journalists. And the claim was nuclear power was going to be so good that, I mean, so easy to generate that it is not going to cost anything. And uh, and for those of you who have seen the film Oppenheimer, Strauss is the kind of villain figure in the film. Okay, so anyway, that's just to give you an example of what kind of expectations were there around the world. And Bhabha was not an exception to that kind of thinking. He also made some assumptions about how easy it is to build nuclear plants and so on and so forth, and made these announcements. Now, there are there's one which is the kind of general assumptions of that period about how nuclear power was going to be easy and cheap and so on and so forth. A second reason was that, nuclear power was known to be expensive even at that time, though there was the expectation that in the future it's going to be cheap. And unlike the United States in the 1940s and 50s, which was a country that was on the cusp of sort of global power, it had won the Second World War with very little losses to itself, with a huge amount of industrial capacity among the richest countries. India was in a very different position, right? India had just won freedom after 2 decades, 2 centuries of British rule, and Bhabha was making a pitch for India, a developing country with a lot of resource constraints, to invest in an expensive and possibly difficult source of technology. And the claim he had to make was, you should invest in this because it is going to deliver development for India by generating large amounts of electricity, right? And so there was an incentive for him to make these claims about nuclear power growing very fast and large amounts of things being set up. So that is part of the problem in the 1950s. Now you fast forward, there's a number of things that happen in between 1950s and now. Okay, the first is that nuclear power plants take longer and are more complicated to build than anybody imagined in the 1950s. So by the time India starts building its first nuclear power plants, the first nuclear power plant to start generating electricity in India are the two Tarapur nuclear reactors that were imported from the United States. So those things started operating in 1969. And then in 1972, the first of the Canadian CANDU starts generating power. Okay. And 1972, that first reactor is built. The second twin reactor is being built. This is in Rajasthan, in Rawatbhata. That's when India conducts a nuclear weapons test in 1974, the first nuclear weapons test. And it was the countries like the United States and Canada were very upset with India because they had supplied the nuclear reactor that was used to produce the plutonium. This is the Cyrus reactor. Cyrus stands for Canada India reactor, and the US supplied heavy water, so the US was tagged onto that name. And both of those countries had given it under the assumption or under the agreement that the reactor would be used only for peaceful purposes, which is also one reason why Indira Gandhi and the Indian government at that time called it a peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. But if a peaceful nuclear explosion sounds like an oxymoron, that's because it is an oxymoron, right? A nuclear explosion is a way to make a nuclear weapon. There's nothing peaceful about it, right? And so other countries didn't buy this whole peaceful nuclear explosion stuff. And so they stopped selling technology to India. So between 1974 and all the way to 2008, the only country that was willing to supply nuclear technology to India was the Soviet Union, then Russia. Okay. And the reason they were interested in selling nuclear technology to India was after, in the 1980s, after the Chernobyl accident, which was the most devastating nuclear accident, nobody was interested in buying nuclear reactors from the Soviet Union, right? Because it had had this terrible record. And India couldn't buy reactors from anybody. So India under Rajiv Gandhi and the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to sell reactors, which eventually came to Kudankulam. Okay, and that's the only country that was willing to sell. Between 2005 and 2008, there was a negotiation of what's called the US-India nuclear deal, which led to the so-called nuclear suppliers group allowing India to buy nuclear technology. Okay, so at this point, there is no technological challenge in terms of being able to purchase nuclear reactors. But between 1974 and 2008, that was a constraint. The Indian Atomic Energy Commission refused to, would typically say, no, this is not a constraint. We have our own indigenous capacity to design reactors and build reactors and so on. But it was slow compared to the rest of the world. So that explains some of the reason why over a period of time it was very difficult to build nuclear reactors fast. Okay.
I mean, sorry, just to jump in. So the assumption that Baba made when I mean, he was pushing for nuclear. What is that? He was pushing for India to be like a nuclear, to have at least much of India's electricity supply come from nuclear. And the
Yes.
assumption that he made, for the knowledge that was, I think, available at the time, I think is fair, right? I mean, because he did not know that the amount. I'm guessing that my assumption is that, at that point in time, we did not know that nuclear reactors would cost so much money, would take so much time. So I think his assumption, at least from a theoretical standpoint, is still. I think the reasoning is sound. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think, there is of course, we don't know what is going on inside Baba's head, right? So we don't know what he was actually thinking. As I said, yes, I think it's a reasonable assumption that he didn't realize how difficult it was going to be, right? He never saw any nuclear electricity be generated within India, right? 1965, he died in a plane crash, or was it 1966? I forget the exact year. 65 or 66, he died in a plane crash. That was before the first nuclear electricity was generated within India. There were a couple of experimental reactors that had been set up, right? But I want to sort of come forward to the post 2008 period. right? And so in the interim, as I said, you could sort of say India was struggling because it could, I mean, the Department of Atomic Energy couldn't import nuclear technology. But what happens after 2008? I think here are sort of two other things that are coming up. One is that in the after the 1980s, one thing we see is that every nuclear power plant proposal is met with public resistance, right?
After
The public
1990?
since the 1980s, right? So it starts with the Narora reactor, which is in near Delhi. The first sort of opposition starts there. Then the next reactor that was the construction started was in Kakrapar in Gujarat. There was even more substantial opposition. And then the Kaiga nuclear plants in the early 90s, there was a huge amount of opposition, right? And then most spectacularly in Kudankulam into 2011, 2012, that period, right? So that is something which is building up over this period. And public resistance can slow down projects, obviously, because they can, try to resist giving up land and so on and so forth. Of course, the way that the government has dealt with this kind of opposition is basically to overrule it, right? They will just send in the police and the army or whatever it is that it takes for them to do, try to buy off people, etc., etc. So opposition doesn't stop the plants, but it can slow down the project. Okay. Then the final thing that I want to come to is the fact that so after 2008, in principle, can import nuclear reactors from France, from the United States, from any other country as well. Okay, this is after the nuclear suppliers group has lifted its restrictions. The Indian NPCL, Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited, and the government of India have been negotiating with France and France's Electricité de France (EDF) over these nuclear reactors that were to be built in Jaitapur in Maharashtra. And in the case of the United States, to build these Westinghouse AP1000 reactors. Initially, those were supposed to be built also in Gujarat, but there was a lot of opposition there. So the government decided to move that to Andhra Pradesh in a place called Kovada. Okay. Now, in these cases, what's happening is that, especially in the case of Jaitapur, the cost of the nuclear reactors is so high for these EPR reactors that France sells, that the price of electricity that would result in would be so high that it just drive up the cost of Indian consumers. So what NPCIL is doing, or what the government of India is doing, is trying to negotiate some way of lowering the price. And this negotiation has been happening for about 15 years at this point, right? And nothing, no end is being reached. So this is another kind of reason why, nuclear power plants have not been built up. So why have we not crossed the 8,000 megawatt thing even now is, I think, a series of these different reasons. I think the current capacity is 7.7 gigawatts, 7,700 megawatts. I think that's, if I remember right, that's the correct current capacity.
Almost there, almost, almost there. Yeah, almost there to 8,000 megawatts. I think
Yeah.
the record that he said, the target that he said. If I can understand, maybe this is slightly a tangent here, but if I can understand, what is if I speak just about India, right? Like, what do you think is like the, like, at least according to you, what is the fundamental opposition to nuclear in terms of India? Uh, is it that the science, is it that India does not have like the is it that India does not have like the relevant expertise to kind of build nuclear, and we don't know that, and we have to probably wait for talent to develop, etc., and we're not ready yet to kind of build nuclear power plants? Second, or is it that we know that everywhere where people or countries or nation states have built nuclear power plants, they are very expensive, and probably it is not the right solution for India. Is the like, so that's what I'm trying to understand. Is the opposition fundamentally on a science perspective, like, it is probably best not even to go there, even if the because the science itself is not sound for nuclear reactors? Or is it for a country like India, the cost really does not make sense? So like, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah. So great question. So first thing I would say is that there is opposition around the world. Okay, India is not an exception. All countries have demonstrated that there is opposition to nuclear power, and from the perspective of people, okay, if you happen to live in a community which is where a nuclear plant is going to be sited, what the community ought to be thinking is that there is a new, very hazardous facility that's going to be built near where we live. Okay. And the reason a nuclear plant is hazardous is because it's fundamentally a nuclear plant. The way to think about it is that it's a very complicated way to boil water. That's ultimately what it is, right? In a coal plant, you burn coal. The heat that is produced is changes the water into steam. The steam drives a turbine. It produces electricity. In a nuclear plant, it's the nuclear fission reaction, okay, which is producing the heat. The problem with the nuclear fission reaction is that it also produces a bunch of radioactive materials, so-called fission products, and the neutrons that are produced in it will convert some otherwise non-nuclear materials, non-radioactive materials, into radioactive materials. These are called activation products. And all of these materials are hazardous to human health. If you're near one of them, you can get a fatal dose of radiation. And so the whole purpose of trying to design a nuclear power plant is to make sure that this stuff doesn't escape out into the biosphere, or at least the probability of it escaping is very, very low. Okay. And that's the ultimate thing. But there are going to be occasions when there is possibly an accident and the stuff just get out. And when there is an accident, even though it's rare, if it happens, the primary impact is going to be on the local communities that live near that particular site of accident. So this is what happened in Chernobyl. This is what happened in Fukushima in Japan and various other places, right? So the radioactive fallout can go very far, but the bulk of the radioactive fallout is going to be in the regions near it. So in the case of Chernobyl, for example, there are still some. Chernobyl, the accident happened in 1986, and it's more than 40 years since that accident. This year was the 40th anniversary. And there are still areas near there where the radiation levels are so high that people cannot go back to their houses where they have lived for a very long time. They had to leave in 1986 and they can never go back, right? And so this is a real possibility, even if it is a low probability possibility. Okay. So in a rational world, or if somebody who's rational will look at this and say, do I really want to live with this risk? Right? I know it's a low risk, low probability risk, but do I really want to do this? And that's a question that many people will ask. And in some cases, we might say, in certain other risk areas that where we face risk, we might look at this trade-off and say it's worth taking that risk. So, for example, I know that when I get into an airplane, there is a slight risk that the plane can crash, right? But if I have to come from Vancouver to Bangalore, then if I decide not to take an aeroplane, my life would, I'm have to sort of write away 3 months of my life if I have to some other way, right? So I look at the convenience, the benefit that I get, and I say, okay, I'm willing to take this risk. Okay. But in the case of people who are living near these plants, there's a real question about, are they really going to benefit from this, right? The electricity, for the most part, in all of these cases, is going to flow to Bombay, to Bangalore, to Madras, and so on and so forth, right? So they are the people who are benefiting. These are the people who are facing the risk, right? And then there's also the concern about the radioactive waste and so on and so forth. And lastly, there's another set of completely different set of concerns which motivate people to be in opposition, and that has to do with the impact of the nuclear power plant on their local livelihoods. So, for example, any nuclear reactor, because it is producing electricity by producing heat first, all reactors, like all thermal plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, have to expel the extra heat. So, by the laws of thermodynamics, not all of the energy in the form of heat can be converted into electricity. Typically, about a third of the heat is converted into electricity. The rest of the two-thirds of the energy has to be taken out of the nuclear power plant, and they'll have to be fed into some water body. If you look in India, pretty much all of the nuclear reactors are on the coast, except for a couple of them, which are Narora and Kaiga and so on and so forth. And in those cases, there is a river or something else, some large lake. So there has to be a large water body. If you are, let's say, a fisher person who is fishing in that particular in that ocean. In the case of Kudankulam, for example, it's the Bay of Bengal that is going to receive all this heat, and that heat is going to kill fish. right? It is going to drive away the fish from that area. It's going to change patterns of fishing. So it affects the livelihood of those. The people whose land is taken away by the nuclear reactor, they are not going to be compensated with another piece of land. They're just going to be given some piece of money. And then what are they going to do with the money? It's not exactly the same as having land which can feed you in multiple ways, right? Especially if you're a family that's completely dependent on farming as your source of livelihood. So there are a number of other concerns that come in where people are opposing this. And so you have to think about both of these kinds of reasons. And it has nothing much to do with the state of nuclear technology or the knowledge of scientists. So, what I was explaining is that opposition to nuclear power is not peculiar to India. It has affected many, many places. What I think, but the opposition to nuclear power is something which is a temporal phenomena. That is, it started in the 80s, in 90s in India, in other countries. Also, it started typically in the 1970s and intensified in the 80s, 90s, and so on and so forth. So countries like the United States and to some extent France and so on have done their nuclear buildup prior to the growth of this kind of opposition, right? India's path was different, right? Or you have to be a country like China where they presumably don't care about this kind of opposition and they go ahead and build it anyway, right? So it's a bit of so the way that opposition affects the course of nuclear policy varies from country to country. So there have been a couple of countries, including most recently Taiwan, which shut down all of its nuclear plants because of public opposition.
So I wanted to. You did mention this, but I just wanted to get your take on the scale of the problem. You did mention that. I mean, ultimately, it's all a series or a decisions of trade-offs, right? Ultimately, it's all a trade-off. If you look at the, my understanding is, if I think the number of deaths that are a result of coal generation is probably exceeds the, I think probably exceed, I mean, we you did bring up the example of Chernobyl and some other, there have been other very noteworthy nuclear disasters, like Fukushima. Chernobyl is another one. I think the island reactor.
Island,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, I think that one also is, I think, popularly well known. These accidents, they are very prevalent in the public imagination, in the public imagination. But I think the number of deaths that they cause, my understanding would be like lesser than, let's say, per year of what coal produces. So in that sense, does that, do you think the public should make that trade-off, or do you still think it's like too dangerous for us to even consider?
Great question. So, the first thing I would say is that as a member of the public, or this question is a little bit like being asked whether I want to die of cancer or of heart attack. The answer is I don't want either of them, right? So, in a way, neither coal nor nuclear power are desirable from the viewpoint of risks to health, right? And so, and but being asked to make this trade-off is something that's a valid would have been a valid question a few decades ago, right? Today the cheapest sources of power happen to be renewables, solar and wind, solar especially, right? And so the answer from most people's perspective will be, I don't want either coal or nuclear. Why don't we do solar? Right, that's what somebody would say, right? And I think from the viewpoint of policymakers too, that should be the answer in a way, right? So from the viewpoint of a member of the public, they don't really care. They just say, look, I want some electricity, and if a solar set of solar panels can provide the power that I use, why should I have to live with this risk of a nuclear power plant or a coal plant, right? There may be larger considerations that other people might have, and we can talk about those issues as well. But the real thing is that this is not necessarily to be thought of as you need to choose coal or you need to choose nuclear power. I think that's a false alternative.
But if I can push back, in terms, again, my understanding is that for a country like India, even if you produce, I think the storage question, I think my ultimate point was going to be that the storage question has not been figured out in terms of solar. My understanding is that even if, I think in India, at one point in the afternoon, I think we produce so much electricity that it essentially becomes free, if I'm not wrong. But let's say at 7 p.m., 8 p.m., where there is not enough sunlight. Unless we
Yes.
solve that storage question, it becomes very difficult to. So, do you think that even today, we still have to kind of make that trade off, and we are not effectively there yet, technologically speaking, or even logistically speaking, like we haven't had that build out in terms of renewables, etc. So, how do you
Yeah,
think
I'll
about that?
say, yeah. So, couple of points. One is, I personally have not done a lot of work thinking about energy planning in India. So, I have to say, for a more general point of view, I'll say how it works, and I'll explain why I think the case of India can be uh, both. There are positives and negatives about thinking about it as renewables. Okay, so in general, all sources of power have their variability. Okay, a nuclear plant has to be shut down during certain parts of the year because they have to be refueled, or some equipment might have to be replaced, and so on and so forth. Coal plants, any plant, basically, there's always going to be some period of time when they have to be shut down, right? So the way that we are getting reliable electricity, to the extent that there is reliability. So here in Vancouver, if I switch on the switch, then typically the light comes on. Okay, so that's what I mean by reliability, right? And I mean, in India, there are times when it doesn't happen, and I've lived there. I know how it is in Bangalore. The newspaper will carry announcements about when there is going to be a shutdown in Rajaji Nagar or wherever you're living, and you plan your activities around that. Okay, I mean, but anyway, the reliability basically means that you should be able to. And the way that the grid tries to be reliable is to have two or three different things. It's basically to have a large number of plants, so that when one is down, others will come on. Okay, so in the case of renewables, the point is very valid. If you're going to have only solar panels, then what happens after 6 p.m. in the evening, or when the sun goes down? That's a perfectly logical question. So the first answer is, you don't ever build a grid based only on one technology, one solar panel, solar plant. You have some wind, you have some hydro, maybe some biomass, a combination of all of these things. So there's a diversity in technology, and also diversity in geography, in that, not it's not so relevant for sun, but for wind. If the wind is not blowing right now in British Columbia, where I live, maybe the wind is blowing in Manitoba, the province that's two provinces over, and the electricity from there can flow into British Columbia, and vice versa, right? So there's also geographical diversity. So that's one way by which you can try to address this question of reliability. The second, and is the way that you mentioned, which is the fact that you could have storage. Okay, and these days, the storage using lithium based batteries have become very cheap, in part because they were used for
Cars.
personal electronics and cars, right? So laptops and stuff like that, and then also cars, right? And so at this point, there are many parts of the world where huge amounts of storage have been installed, right? So in California, for example, I forget the exact number, but it's probably more than the nuclear capacity of India in terms of the battery capacity in California. Okay, and this has all been a fairly recent story. But batteries are not the only form of storage. There are multiple technologies out there, and you're right that we don't have kind of a mature one technology that is one, but maybe we will never have that one technology. And that's because storage actually serves multiple roles inside a grid, right? So storage can be used to manage this kind of the problem that we started with, which is that there is no sun between, let's say, 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, right? So there's that window that you have to think about. But it can also be used to deal with frequency fluctuations, all kinds of other sort of longer term storage, etc., etc. And each of those things might not be best served by batteries. So there are other ways by which you can store energy. And this is at this point a very widely open technology field. Huge amounts of money are going in, lots of research is happening. And I personally don't think we can be confident that by, let's say, 2030, I mean, by 2040, we will know what is going to be the storage technology. We don't really know at this point. And the third bucket of solutions for the variability of solar and wind and so on is the fact that is the variability, is the possibility that you can modify the demand for electricity, right? Our demand for electricity in Bangalore or in Vancouver is not constant, right? It's going to go up during the morning, it comes down a little bit, it comes back up in the evening, and then in the night it goes down, and then it varies over the year, whether it is summer or winter, how much AC you use or how much heating we use in the winter. All kinds of things are going to be played, right? But not all of the demand necessarily needs to be met at the moment it is generated, right? So for example, if somebody has a washing machine in their house, you can modulate when you use the washing machine, right? Do you run it during the day or do you run it during the night? And that can depend on when the electricity is plentifully available. Now, in the past, you might say, oh, I can't go back in the middle of the day from my office to go and turn on my washing machine just because solar power is this thing. But these days, much of this has become much more automatic, right? And so in the US, for example, there is this whole growth of what are called virtual power plants, which are basically companies that come to consumers and they say, hey, let's have we're going to offer you a contract by which we pay you a certain amount of money every month, and you allow us to modulate your demand. So for example, you will allow us to change your refrigerator setting. I lower the temperature, I increase the temperature by a few degrees when I want to lower the demand. Your food is not going to go bad because after half an hour I will set it back to the same thing. But during that half an hour period, I have a momentary decrease in your demand, right? Now, individual consumers' demand doesn't matter much, but if you can aggregate tens of thousands of consumers, that can be quite a sizable amount of demand. And then these companies go to the utility company that sells the electricity, and they say, "Hey, we can offer you this flexibility in demand, and you pay us a certain amount of money. I keep half of the money, and some part of the money goes to the consumer." Okay, so these are called virtual power plants, and that's also a growth industry. There are many estimates about how. So there are a bunch of ways by which you can manage the variability of renewables. Okay. What renewables have in their favor is not just that the overall cost is low, but once you install, the what's called the marginal cost, the extra cost of producing one extra kilowatt hour is essentially zero, right? Because once you have your solar panel, you don't have to spend any money. Whereas if you have a coal plant, you have a nuclear plant, you need to buy the coal or the uranium, you have to pay the workers, and so additional electricity, it will always cost you a certain amount. Okay, so once the utility company has a certain capacity for renewables, they would like to use it as much as possible, right? That's the economic logic there, right? And so anyway, coming to India, there are both a plus and a minus here. So in countries like the US and Canada and so on, as renewables have become cheaper, when the renewable energy installation becomes very large, what then happens is sometimes there is so much power being generated by these renewables that all of the other plants have to be shut down, okay? Because you can't use all the electricity, right? And because renewables are producing zero marginal cost power, there's an incentive to use it. So then you have to shut down your nuclear plant or a coal plant. In some cases, that's not practically feasible, because in the case of a nuclear plant, when you shut it down, to restart it you have to go through a lengthy process. There are some safety challenges. And so what then the nuclear plant owners do is to say, we don't want to shut this down. Instead, how about we give you some money and you shut down your solar plant or you disconnect it from the grid. Okay. And in countries like Germany and so on, there are times of the day and the year when the electricity prices actually become negative, because somebody is willing to pay money to another power plant, typically a renewable energy power plant, to shut down their production, because there is too much of the demand is already being met with whatever is. So that's an example of when this situation with renewables is really changing very fast, right? That they are producing so much power. In India, that is never going to be a problem at this point, because our energy, we are not meeting all of the electricity demand for the most, I mean, not entirely, but there is always much more power that could be consumed. If it was cheap enough, more people will use more, right? So we are at a place where, I mean, India is at a place where it can grow much faster, and this growth can come without having this challenge of having to shut down existing plants, right? Which is the challenge in the West. So that is one thing. On the flip side, a lot of the time when there are blackouts and brownouts in India, it is not happening because of the necessarily because of a shortage of electricity, but because, let's say, some transformer blows up, and because that has not been replaced, or there is some place where people are there's some problem with the wires and the wires have not been replaced. So there's a lot of other maintenance costs, which that's a different problem in a way. It doesn't have to do whether it's renewables or not. Anyway,
Um,
yeah, all that is a long way of explaining that I think the idea of renewables are inherently challenged by the unavailability of storage is a story that I would question.
so here, I think you will see a display of my not so very clear thinking. But I think there should be three separate questions, but I think I'll probably just frame it in one. So one is on the question of China, um, because because so there are two angles, right? So one is on the China angle and one is on the data center angle. The China angle is very simple, which is that we spoke about how China doesn't really have to take the consent of the public when they are building, if they want to test out new ideas in terms of nuclear, right? Let's say their scientists have come up with some new theory and now they want to go ahead and test out. They do not have to go to Rajajinagar and ask people to, like, start taking a survey, start, if nobody agrees, they can just move them out. So the feasibility of trying out new ideas and, in terms of nuclear, etc., becomes very easy for them. So that is part number one. The second part, I'm tying another thread to this China angle, which is that recently, because of the AI data center boom, there has been a lot of investment. There has been a lot of, power seems to be the major bottleneck in terms of building out these data centers, at least in the US. And I think this will be true globally as well. That a lot of the countries just do not have the capacity to kind of, feed, or they just do not have the electricity capacity to kind of make these data centers operational. In that sense, I see like a lot of investment going, and I think there's been a lot of news about this as well, where companies, large big tech companies, are funding a lot of their money into nuclear ideas, either in startups or legacy nuclear companies. Even though these threads are separate, I'm broadly reaching out to, like, because there is this renewed interest, and China also has this option of, like, not really caring about the public, and going ahead and trying out many different things on a very larger scale. Do you think that new opportunities might come up, or broadly, like, is there hope that some of the things that may not be possible due to money, etc., could really start working out now because there's so much interest and there's so much money behind it? Yeah, it's a broad question, but you can take a stab at it.
Yeah, great question. So, if democracy is not a constraint, then can nuclear power work? Is one way to put it, right? And so, I think in China, I don't want to kind of paint China in a completely, they don't really care about the public type image, because even there, the Communist Party has to be concerned about how people think about it, right? It's not through the same modes of election being gone out of power, but there are lots of protests in China, and there's concerns that the government sort of addresses. All that is to say, I don't want to just say, oh, China is like this, it's a complete dictatorship, etc., etc. I just don't want to give that impression. But I'm just saying that in a way, and by the way, I should also mention there have been some protests in China over nuclear facilities, and the Chinese government has cancelled some proposed nuclear projects. Okay, so that's also something I just want to put out there. But coming back to your question, so I think China is, yes, they have a kind of capacity to build facilities of all kinds at a rate that is not seen anywhere in the world, right? Whether it is, we might remember the hospitals that they built during the initial weeks and months of the coronavirus crisis in Wuhan and elsewhere, right? Where within like a few weeks they built this amazing facility, at least from what we see on the pictures, right? We none of us went there, but assuming that they were not sort of faking it, right? So but and this is true with high speed rail and all kinds of things, and this is also true for them with solar power and wind energy. The amounts of solar power plants, their capacity they're putting online every year, is they're breaking world records year after year after year, right? And they are dominating the production of solar panels. Lots of countries are importing it. They have broken into the EV market. The BYD cars are supposed to be among the best electric cars and so on and so forth. So China is in a state which is very different from other places in terms of the infrastructure to produce anything, right? Any kind of manufacture. So, to some extent, nuclear power is going to benefit from that. But I want to come back to the point that I mentioned earlier, which is that nuclear power is important or interesting only to the people who are promoting nuclear power. For the general consumer, for somebody who's running an industry in China or in India, for for any other category of people, they shouldn't care whether it's a nuclear power plant that is producing the electricity that they're using, or it's a a solar utility scale solar plant, or it is a hydropower plant. Whatever, it doesn't really matter to them unless you happen to live near that facility, in which case you have to be worried about accidents, about pollution, etc., etc. But if you're somebody who's sitting in Beijing or in Delhi and you say, I need more and more power, then you really don't care. You really don't care where the power is coming from. So, just one second. Can you just give me 1 second? I just closed the door here. Sorry.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah, sure, sure.
Sorry, my daughter keeps coming in and it just bothers the hell out of me. So,
No, no, that's
anyway,
fine. Absolutely
yeah.
fine. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's the challenge with the 10 p.m. at night. I'm at home, so people are coming into my room. Okay, so I think so. The thing about, can China do something? I think yes and no, right? So yes, I can imagine that Chinese are able to build nuclear plants faster than elsewhere. They may be able to build it cheaper than elsewhere, but they will also be able to build solar and wind also faster and cheaper than elsewhere, right? And so again, from the viewpoint of the consumer, if the solar and wind are generating electricity at a much lower price and the batteries have become cheaper and so on, why do I care about the nuclear power? So the differential in the cost and the time are going to be true in China as well as it's in the other countries. So that's one thing. The second thing I'll say is, there are some things which are the kind of the laws of nature, as it were, right? So a nuclear plant will always generate radioactive materials. That's because the physical process that is producing the heat, the fission process, will always produce radioactive materials. And because of the complexity of the technology, even in China, there is always a risk that there is going to be an accident. And in fact, there are a lot of people who would be more afraid about an accident in China than it's say France or the United States, because there is a concern that we don't know how well these things are regulated. If the government says you need to build your plant in 3 years and the regulator says, well, I need to do my safety checks and so on and so forth, maybe they are overruled there, right? And so then that makes it more likely that there's going to be a risk of an accident and things of that sort. So but back to the basic point, the challenges with the nuclear power plant, building nuclear power plants, are going to be true in some ways also in the case of China because of the nature of the technology, right? And that's not, China is no exception to that. It's not like the laws of physics don't work there.
Uh, um, moving on from China to, do you see any impact of the? I mean, part of the reason I feel, again, one of the reasons I reached out to you to speak about nuclear is also because of the recent AI data center boom. There has been a lot of chatter about, you know. One is on the electricity shortages, but also nuclear being a very viable option at this point to kind of serve that need, because the current grid may not really support the capacity that is needed. Um, do you see that making any difference at all? Like, so just to take a step back here, so till now we have majorly discussed a few things. One is that nuclear reactors are very hard to build. They are very
Hmm.
difficult to build. They're very hard to build. They're dangerous. They are dangerous to the communities that are living near that reactor. Second, they're very expensive. And also we spoke about how there are other ways of kind of generating the same electricity. You can do
Hmm.
it through solar, you can do it through wind, biomass, etc. um, so that is one part of what we discussed. But in the news, we do see that there is a lot of push for, I think Microsoft signed a number of deals. I think Meta recently
Yes.
signed a number of deals. OpenAI is also considering. I think Sam is an active investor in this company called Oklo, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
And so here you see that one thing that you see is that these companies are not advocating for more and more, let's build more solar, let's build more wind, etc. Or there seems to be specific deal making in terms of nuclear. Point number one is, what do you make of this?
Mhm.
Point number two would be, will there be any changes due to this, because of this? So again, like I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
there's so much of money being pumped in, there's so much of excitement. And do you
Mhm.
see any reason that maybe new ideas might come out of this, and there might be a betterment, or there it could flip as well, and there might be some accident, etc. So in broad comment here, yeah.
Yeah, great question. And this is something which comes up all the time. Okay. So I will start by saying when companies make announcements, I'm not on Sam terms with him, so I'll say Altman. When people like Altman say things, you have to sort of look underneath to say why they are saying something. All right. It's never innocent. It is never completely sincere. They are always having some other angle there. So, for example, if Sam Altman is talking up nuclear power, you have to say, well, is this because he is on the board of Oklo, right? And so there is a reason for him to talk up nuclear power, right? Because he's an investor. Now, why are they investing in it? I'll come to that later. That's a separate question. But I will start by saying, if you look at these announcements made by Microsoft, Google, Amazon, all of these companies, they are broadly speaking two kinds of announcements, okay? Or maybe three kinds of announcements about nuclear power. One set of announcements, okay, let's just back up. Why are they making these, and why is there any question about this? Because the demand for electricity from these data centers to cool these chips is growing very, very rapidly. Okay. And these companies are in some ways struggling to find electricity to meet their growing demand. And the reason why this is happening in a way is because the way that typically the sort of the power for these facilities would have been met is by they just plug into the grid, they build a factory, and they say, okay, can you please supply power to the local utility company, right? And the utility company, in some cases, in the early stages, they probably could do that, right? But as time goes on, the utility company has to start building new infrastructure. It could be new generation, it could also be transmission lines, distribution lines, etc., etc. Those things then translate into higher costs for the utility company, which they are passing it on to the consumers. So as a result, in the United States, there are several places where their power costs have been rising dramatically, right? And there are multiple stories about how, in the news media, about how, some small family is suddenly paying, 100% more for their electricity, etc., etc., right? And so there's a lot of pushback. This has become an election issue in the midterm elections. A number of candidates have been voted out in the primaries because they supported data centers, etc., etc. So there is this, that's a larger picture that's happening, and a lot of it has to do with this rapid growth in demand, right? And I would love, we can talk about whether that demand should be growing, whether we should be building those data centers. Those are questions I think we should all be asking. But for the present, coming back to the focusing on the nuclear plants, let's just say, assume it is there, that demand. At least right now there is a demand. And the thing with, so there are three kinds of deals that they have talked about. One, where the company says, okay, I want this electricity and I am going to negotiate with some utility company to supply me with power. And what kind of power? So typically the utility companies is going to say, we're going to give you whatever power we have. Okay. Now, the thing to remember is that as we mentioned earlier, nuclear power plants are expensive, right? They're expensive to build and they're expensive to operate as well. So if you go back about a decade, so between, let's say, 2012, 2013 to about 2020, 21, there was a number of nuclear plants in the United States that were shut down because they were just too expensive for the utility company. They were losing money on these things. This is happening primarily in the United States is a very complicated. There are, broadly speaking, two kinds of regulatory patterns. So there are some states where there is a public utilities commission or some kind of a public regulator. If they say that this particular power plant is justified, then that power plant can charge whatever cost, and that's fine. So that's one kind of state. There are other places where electricity is basically traded on a marketplace. Okay. And so every day this company that is supplying electricity will say, I project that tomorrow I'm going to need 6,000 megawatts of electricity, right? Who wants to supply how much? So one company, a generating company, will say, okay, I can supply 40 megawatts at $36 per megawatt hour. And then another company might say, I can supply 300 megawatts, but mine is going to cost $70 per megawatt hour, and so on and so forth. So what basically these companies do is to look at all the available supply. The moment they meet their expected demand, the top cost that they rank it according to cost. Obviously, you'll buy the cheapest first and then the higher and higher ones. But at some point, everybody gets the same price. So the ones which are cheap get more profit. But in this kind of a system, there are times when the nuclear plants are just priced out. They are not able to compete. They're not able to bid in these auctions at a price where which is lower than everybody else. And so then the utility company says, no, thank you very much. We don't want your nuclear power. Okay, so a number of nuclear plants in the US were shut down for this reason, including the 3 Mile Island reactor. There were two reactors in 3 Mile Island. One of them melted down, the other one was still operational. And then in 2019, the company that was operating it decided to shut it down because it had not made money for 5 years. So some of these kinds of, so in general, nuclear power plants are expensive. Okay, are expensive ways. So if Microsoft or Meta or somebody comes to a utility company and they say, hey, I'm going to make a deal with you. You have these expensive nuclear plants. I'm happy to buy power from you at, let's say $120 per megawatt hour, even though the normal market price is $73 per megawatt hour. I'll buy it from a higher price, but you have to guarantee that you're going to supply me this power for the next 20 years or whatever it is, right? And so it seems like a win-win deal in those kinds of circumstances. Okay. So in those cases, what is basically happening is nuclear power that normally would be sold on the marketplace to be meeting consumer demands for, in people's houses and in offices and so on, is being diverted to these data centers. Okay, so that's a limited pool of some reactors. And then there are some of these reactors like this 3 Mile Island reactor, which were shut down because they were uneconomical. There is some talk about reopening some of those things, and Microsoft has a deal to reopen one of those things. But all of those things are very limited in terms of how much power they can actually generate compared to how much power is required by these data centers. Okay, and I can sort of explain those numbers in a bit, but before I get into those numbers, I'll also say there's a third kind of deal, which is involving all these new technologies that you talked about, so-called small modular reactors and things of that sort. So those are the ones which actually started this whole game. It was Google announced in October 2024 an agreement with a company called Kairos Power, and then followed by Amazon, which made a deal with a company called X Energy, and so on. That's where, in a way, if you have to be excited, you should be excited about those, because that's the only time when they're actually talking about building new nuclear plants, right? Everything else is the existing plants or a shutdown plant, and the number of shutdown plants essentially is 3 shutdown plants. Even if they were all going to come online, they can generate maybe something like 15 terawatt hours every year, which is, and the last year the data centers in the United States required about 312 terawatt hours. So 15 terawatt hours versus 312 terawatt hours. Obviously, you can see nuclear power can't supply a lot of the electricity. So the question is whether there are going to be new nuclear reactors that are built because of the money that is flowing, right? That's where you have to look at these announcements very carefully, right? So when you look at the actual announcements, they don't say something like, oh, we are going to build a new nuclear plant or anything of that sort. What they basically say is something like, Amazon's announcement, for example, said they were going to fund the initial feasibility phase of an SMR project in exchange for the right to purchase electricity from the project with 4 modules, which is expected to generate 320 megawatts of energy capacity. Okay. But I'm sure Amazon has very smart lawyers, and those smart lawyers will say having the right does not mean that you have to purchase it. Right? I have the right to buy your electricity if you start generating, but there will be a lot of fine print. I will buy it if the price is good enough for me, if it is being generated in a reliable fashion, etc., etc. Right? Otherwise, I'm not going to be interested. And so we don't know what is inside those deals. Right? That's all secret stuff. But the public announcement is actually far more careful than what naively one may think, that Amazon has decided to invest in nuclear power. You can go to the Google announcement, there are same kind of caveats there, right? It's a kind of, they say we're going to sell under certain kinds of power purchase agreements, but they don't reveal what the power purchase agreements. However, there is something else which we can look at. If you look at all these announcements, you ask the question, are they promising money here? How much money are they planning to invest? Right? And the I've been looking at these things. Google, for example, does not even tell you how many dollars they are putting into this deal with Kairos. Amazon and a bunch of different, what you call it, investors together have promised to invest $500 million. Okay, in this X energy thing. There's another group involving TerraPower, which is the company that Bill Gates started, and Nvidia, and so on. They have promised to invest $650 million. Okay, now to put that in perspective, the cost of one small modular reactor nuclear power plant from this Natrium project from the Bill Gates company, it's estimated to be something like $9.2 billion or something like that. This is the initial estimate. Okay. And for that, they could get 350 megawatts roughly of electricity. Okay. That's not a lot of electricity compared to the scale of the demand that they are having. Right. And $650 million, and if you think about the last set of nuclear plants that were built in the United States, these are the so-called Vogel reactors. There were two AP1000 reactors. The two reactors generate 2200 megawatts of electricity. They cost $36.8 billion. That's billion with a B, right? And these people are saying we're investing $500 million, $600 million. It's not like Amazon or Google don't have the money. They are spending every year in the hundreds of billions on their infrastructure, but they are only willing to spend a few $100 million or commit a few $100 million. So for me, I look at this and say, they're not serious about nuclear power. If they were really serious, they would just say, okay, here is $50 billion, go build me a few nuclear plants. They're not doing that. They are basically saying, we'll put some money, you do whatever, blah, 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 right? For me, it looks like this is all part of a PR budget rather than actual energy budget, right? It's a public relations thing. And why are they doing this public relations thing? I'll finish with that little also explanation. The reason they are talking about this, thinking about this as public relations, is because there is a lot of concern about the amount of energy use, about emissions. And if you remember, all of these big tech companies in the around 2019, 2020, that time frame, they all made these promises, right? A few years after the Paris Accord, they all said, oh, we are going to be net zero by 2030, 2040, blah, 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 right? All their emissions have gone up since then, right? Partly because of these data centers, right? So they have to control the potential backlash from public who are concerned that the climate is going for a 6, and in part it is because of all these data centers. So their answer is, oh, don't worry about it, we are building nuclear plants. Okay, when are these nuclear plants going to be built? They're probably going to be built in 2035. Okay, that's a very, I think, safe guess. They're not going to get before that. But their demand for electricity is today, right? They're not waiting for 2035. So nuclear is going to face no. And to be very honest, I don't think any of us should be confident that there is going to be this huge demand by 2035, because the AI bubble is going to burst sooner or later, right? It's a big bubble. There's a lot of crazy money going after it. And we know all the kind of shady stuff that Nvidia and Oracle and all of them are doing. It's driving to a point where the market is going to collapse, right? And the moment it collapses, not only will the data center market go, it'll also take away all these SMR models markets with it.
Uh, so, uh, so we have to stop here, Professor, because it's almost noon here, and I have to get
Okay.
back to work. But I do want to ask you a very quick question, and I want to close with this. And I don't know if you want to comment on this or if you want to pass this. It's up to you. So, with the final portion of the final portion of the episode was mostly regarding the company's investment into data centers and nuclear slash data centers. If we make the assumptions that the AI boom, if we make the assumptions that data centers are going to be very pivotal for a nation's, I don't know, not economy per se, but I mean, if AI it does indeed become a major part of an economy or people's lives, data centers become very crucial. Like how currently, without if you remove the AI data centers, right? I think data centers in general are very important for like web servers for us to communicate
Yes.
via this online, etc. Things like that. If we make the assumption that AI itself becomes a very important part of people's lives, then data centers obviously correlated to that, data centers will also will be very
Correct.
important. If I can come we make that assumption as true, then what do you think, what does that mean for India, where we are not able to meet the public demand for electricity? How, like, will we lose in that race, and are there any consequences you see because of that? If you want to make a comment on that generally.
Yeah, I'm happy to make a comment. I think this is something which is, many people are going to have different opinions on this, right? I've kind of played my cards already when I said this bubble is going to burst, and I don't think this is actually going to go forward, right? So we have to ask ourselves the question, and this is not just true in India. I live in Canada. Okay, Canada is playing the same catch-up game. Okay, they want to build data centers here in Vancouver. There are lots of us who went and protested, and they've actually decided to postpone the decision and stuff like that. And but coming back to the point, I think this is it's a very difficult question for somebody who's in power in government, right? Because they have to, if they are being honest and they are trying to do their due diligence, they have to say, well, yes, it's possible this is going to be a gigantic opportunity and we'll be missing out on that. But there's also the probability that this thing will fizzle, that actually this is not something we should be entering into. And it's a particular problem in a place like India for two reasons. One is you're already short of power, there's already water shortages and stuff like that. That's also true in the US, it's also true in Canada, but it's more true in India. And so you're going to be taking away stuff from people who are already suffering and giving it to these data centers, right? So you know that Google is planning something near Vizag, and there's a lot of protests against that, right? But there are the people. So there's that one question. The second is, how exactly does it impact the economy in general? Right. So, what is the business model for these AI and data center, AI in particular, not even the Amazon type of data centers, but these are data centers used to train large language models, where the costs are running into the trillions of dollars at this point, the investments. Right. So, what kind of thing can actually produce the kind of revenues for
Returns.
the for returns for OpenAI and Anthropic and so on? The only thing they can probably hope to is to sell it to companies where the company can basically use the AI system to fire half their workers, right? And put the other workers, tell the other workers, you have to work 10 times as hard, or twice as much, and you're going to be paid 50% less, because if you refuse to do that, we will fire you also, right? And so it's a way to control labor, to make the power of the labor to organize, to fight for their due compensation much harder. All right. So in that kind of a situation, what is going to be the impact on India? Right. India already has a very large number of young people who don't have jobs. Right. And so if you're a government official and you're thinking about this, you have to ask the question: do we want to roll out AI in the manner that actually it could make economic sense for these handful of companies with a few mega, I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars people, whatever you want to call them? They're not billionaires anymore, they're 100 billionaires and soon to be trillionaires. For a handful of people to make huge amounts of money, do we want to actually translate this, right? And so I think it's a difficult question. I mean, I'm very clear in where I'm standing. I don't think this is actually something that's going to take wide root. I think the problems are too deep with this AI thing. It's not a business model that makes sense, because if you think about it from the viewpoint of, the way that I encounter many of these data centers, I mean, these AI models, is that my students might use it to write assignments or exam reports and things of that sort. Now, if those students actually have to pay for using ChatGPT, the actual cost of how much it takes to train that model and run, answer that essay question, they will not be able to afford it, right? It should probably cost them $200 to get an essay being written, whatever. I'm just making up a number, right? And that is not the business. So it's not ever going to be a business model where individual consumers are going to be able to pay the cost of producing it, right? So it's the business model just doesn't square in my mind, right? And so I'm loath to sort of assume that it is going to be big, it is going to dominate the world, and so on and so forth, because I don't see that happening, right? And if it does, yes, you're very right, India will be left behind. India is already not anywhere near the US or China, and I don't think the US or China are waiting for India to catch up, right? So it's a race which is, one is going at sort of supersonic speed, and the other one is going at sort of good strain speed, if you like. And that the distance is only going to be increasing. I don't think there's any way of sort of meeting that. But this is something which, we are all speculating at this point, right? And I will admit that I'm also speculating. I just don't see this as necessarily a race that people should be engaged in.
I think on that note, thank you so much for taking the time, Professor. Really appreciate it. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Just call me Ramana.
Uh,
No need to call me Professor. It's a great pleasure to talk to you.